I'm kind of a gardener, and I use the term very loosely. So this March, just a couple of months ago, I decided I was going to plant some blackberry and some raspberry bushes. And so I went to Tractor Supply, and I got some bare root plants and dug some holes and, put in a bunch of soil conditioner and with, the soil like you're supposed to do, and put in some nutrients and stuff and popped them in there and put some mulch on them and watered them, and the results were really mixed. So some of them did okay, and then some of them really not so okay. In fact, about 2/3 of them never came up, and I actually took them out of the ground and put them in pots to see, with even better soil, to see if I can get them to come along. And this is what they look like today. So that's them. That's like my raspberry thing, and I don't really understand it because, I did have some that came up, and so, I planted them in the same hole with, got the plants from the same place, the same soil, the same sun exposure. Everything was exactly the same, and some of them did well and some of them didn't. Some of them thrived and some of them not so much. And, it's a lot like raising children. Often, children from the same household, turn out very, very, very different. So about 2 weeks ago, I decided I was going to do a reboot. And I'm going to get actually the raspberry patch right, because my daughter Jessie, who's here today visiting for Mother's Day, she loves raspberries. And so I really researched it, and I discovered all kinds of things that I didn't know before about raspberries. I discovered that raspberries like dappled sunlight. I don't know if you guys know that, but they like filtered sunlight, like 4 hours of direct sunlight, then some dappled light in there, and they like loamy soil, like with lots of peat moss and stuff like that. And I, researched the exact stuff to put in there, and they need a trellis and all that stuff. And so 2 weeks ago, I put in a brand new raspberry patch with some of my ones that made it, and then some of the other ones I went to the store and got some starters. And this is what it looks like today. So, pretty good. So I'm like really proud of that, and I feel like, I'm looking at that and I'm going, yeah, man, I'm like a master gardener, I'm like, this is really good. And I took that picture like 2 days ago, and I went out there this morning, and they were even taller. Like, they're growing like really, really fast. And so I believe that when it comes to raising children, that God desires His people be master gardeners, to create an environment where children can be spiritually rich and healthy and successful. And I believe that the Bible gives us insight into how to do that. And so we're going to take a break from Colossians today. I know that you guys are all, really upset about that. And so we've been going, for those of you who are not normally here, we've been going verse by verse and backing up and going for it. I mean, we've been in Colossians already a while, and I think we're up to like verse 20. So, but that's great because it's an awesome book, and we'll get back to that next time. But I want to, because it's Mother's Day and because we have a baby dedication today. Lillian Smizer is being dedicated. So I just felt like the occasion called for something a little more specific, a little more direct. So we're going to talk about the ministry of parenthood. And for that, we're going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 4. And the passage reads like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. You probably recognize that from the Great Commandment. Jesus quotes this verse. And I'm sure it may surprise some of you, or maybe not, but it's also in the context of children and raising a family. He says, these commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And then there's a parallel verse that goes through the same thing, maybe not quite as detailed as this, but it's the same sentiment later on in chapter 11. And that one concludes with a promise. And the promise is this: so that the days and the days of your children may be many in the land the Lord swore to give to your forefathers, as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth. And so the idea here is that if we love God and teach our children to love God, that we will be blessed. And the passage, the part from Deuteronomy 11, talks about the promised land. And yet I believe that it's more than the physical inheritance. For those of you who understand the covenant and all about the promised land and all of that, it's a physical inheritance. But I do believe that the passage also implies a tremendous spiritual blessing. And so the idea here is that as parents, it is our responsibility to teach our children to love God. And as we do that, it will go well with us. And it will go well with them, because we have given them the most precious gift of all, and that is a happy, healthy, loving relationship with the Lord. And that's important, that this is in the context of love, that this passage is. And the great thing about this passage is that it actually gives us some incredible insights and directions and instructions about how we are to go about doing that. And the first thing that it talks about, or that's implied in the text, is that we ourselves are to have a rich, satisfying, loving relationship with the Lord, because we cannot pass on that which we ourselves do not have. Again, it says, love the Lord your God. So that's the first command. You love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. And so he's talking to the adults in the crowd, that they are to have this kind of relationship with God. And so the passage is about loving God. And then there's this clear progression as we work through the passage, that as we love God, we then pass on that love to our children, that we are to model what it is that we desire our children to emulate. Because then he says, talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And so he's talking about setting an example. And so this passage is about us having that relationship and setting that example for our children. Now, there's lots of ways that we set an example for our children. I think really for starters, and I know this sounds cliche and kind of like the Sunday school answer, but we go to church, that we're faithful in that we're faithful in reading our Bibles, we're faithful in prayer, because we can't pass on what our children do not see us doing. And if we're not faithful in these things, then they will not be faithful in these things. And so they may or may not catch it, but they're not going to catch it if you don't do it at all. And so it's important for us to set that example and to make those things a priority. Another way that we set an example is through always doing the right thing, or what the Bible calls righteousness. And to live lives and set an example of character and integrity. That if they see us as people who are very concerned about the right thing and doing the right thing, then that is something that hopefully we can instill in them. I think another way we set an example for our children is by instilling the principles of the kingdom in our home. That we instill the principles of love, as this passage talks about, of grace, of peace, of mercy, of goodness, of truth in our home. That we live out the values of the kingdom that God tells us to live, all the time. But we start with those things in our home. Now, I have a friend, and I'm not normally one for reading stuff, like poems and, like cliche internet stuff. But this friend of mine has a newsletter, and he had this, this thing in there that I thought was really good and really appropriate. And I don't know where he got it, but I want to read it to you because it's about this idea of setting an example. And again, I think it's really good. It's entitled, When You Thought I Wasn't Looking. And it reads like this: When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw you hang my first picture on the center of the refrigerator. I felt so special that when you were looking, I colored and painted picture after picture just for you. You received each one with the same enthusiasm as the first, and I learned about joy for the first time. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw you feed, clean, and find a home for that stray dog. I learned that it was good to be kind to animals, so when you were looking, I brushed the family dog, and you smiled approvingly. When you thought I wasn't looking, I felt you kiss me goodnight and tell me how precious I was to you. I knew you loved me, so when you were looking, I held my arms for you to lift me up so I could rest in your arms. When you thought I wasn't looking, I heard you tell others how I was a blessing to your life. I learned the power of edifying words, and when you were looking, I couldn't wait to follow you around and ask questions and learn to do things from you. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw you read your Bible and then kneel in prayer. I knew there was a God for me, so when you were looking, I walked the aisle and accepted Jesus into my heart. When you thought I wasn't looking, I heard you rehearse songs for the choir. I learned the value of practice and perseverance. And so when you were looking, I sang my first solo in the Christmas play and saw the gleam in your eye as you mouthed the words with me. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw you looking in the mirror disapprovingly as you ran your hands over the new wrinkles on your face. I learned only a little of aging, but when you were looking, I couldn't help but tell you how beautiful you were and how it made you blush. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw your aged hands tremble as you ran your fingers over the pictures in the family album. I saw tears come from your eyes, and I learned that things hurt sometimes and that it was all right to cry. I didn't know how to comfort you, so I just sat and listened to the stories of your youth. I learned there would be times of loneliness as loved ones passed on to eternity, and I learned of the hope you have to see them in heaven. I feel that loneliness now as I pass my hand over your picture. You are with the Lord, but I have the same hope in Christ as you had before me. One day when you're not looking, Christ will lead me to your side, and we will look through eternity together. That's what it means to set an example of love and grace and goodness and truth. You know, your life is the greatest sermon you will ever preach. And it's the greatest sermon that your children will ever see. Make it a good one. This passage instills in us and charges us the responsibility to set an example of true spirituality, authentic spirituality, not legalistic spirituality or some of the ways that we can get off track, but loving the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and allowing your children to see that in you and in your life, and allowing it to color everything that you do. But the passage doesn't stop there, does it? It talks about how we not only need to set that example, but we need to expressly teach them. And teaching in the Scriptures usually takes, really kind of two different directions, or has two different aspects. There's instruction, and then there's what we call guidance and or discipline. And so this passage here talks about instruction directly. And it's very clear, like it is in other passages, like Psalm 34:11, which says, "Come, my children, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." Now, I'm going to kind of back into the passage a little bit, or come at it from kind of not what we should do, but possibly what we shouldn't do. And I think there are a number of mistakes that Christian parents make when they are instructing their children. And the first one is only using the Bible as a hammer in times of discipline to elicit guilt or compliance. You know, the passage doesn't talk about the spirit of, that's not the spirit of the passage. The spirit of the passage, again, is love. The spirit of the passage is grace. I have a friend who used to get so upset with her mother because the only time the Bible was ever mentioned in their home, the only time it was ever brought up is when she was in trouble. And then it was, well, you're not living the way the Bible says, and God's disappointed in you, and you've let God down, and you need to step it up so that, you can be what the Bible teaches. And that's pretty much a surefire way to teach your children to hate God and to hate the Bible. And it's also a way to reinforce your own hypocrisy. The Bible is not meant as a hammer, especially in your own family, especially with your children. And there are times of discipline, and we'll talk about that later, but that's not the spirit of this passage. We're teaching them to love, and that's the spirit. We want them to have a loving, healthy relationship with God. I think the second mistake that people make is that they don't do anything. Christian parents often feel overwhelmed or inadequate teaching their own children. They're like, man, I've never been to seminary. I'm not all that spiritual. I don't really know the Bible like I should. So who am I to teach my children? And then there's this caveat they often throw out there. Well, I'm just going to let my children make up their own mind. And you're right. You are inadequate. We're all inadequate, but the truth is that you're the best teacher that your children have because you're the one that the Lord has given to them. You're the one that He has placed in their lives to speak into their lives. And if you have done what we talked about earlier, if you've done a good job setting that example, not that you're perfect, but that you've done your best trying to set a positive, healthy example for your children, then you're going to have the moral authority and the respect to be able to speak into their lives. Now, then there's this other piece. I'm just going to let my children make up their own mind. That sounds super noble, but that's actually a ludicrous statement. It makes absolutely no sense because your children, especially small children, are not even equipped to make up their own mind. They're equipped to absorb and to learn. That's how they're wired. That's the relationship that God has given you and them, that you're supposed to teach them about life. You're supposed to teach them about the things of the world, and that's your responsibility. And if you don't teach them about God and spirituality, somebody else will. I'm not saying that you need to coerce them or, again, you need to be heavy-handed, but there needs to be that instruction. For example, you teach your children how to cross the street in a safe way. You teach your children not to lie or steal or hit. You teach your children to read. You teach your children lots of things. You see that as your responsibility. So how then is it not your responsibility to likewise teach them a healthy, loving spirituality? I think a third mistake that Christian parents often make is to leave all of the spiritual instruction to the church. Hey, we're going to get a good church with a good children's program, and then we got it covered. We don't have to do anything else. I was at a church in California, and there was a family. They had two children, like 7 and 8 years old. And every single week, they would show up before Sunday school, open the door, the kids would hop out of the car, come into the church, and then after church, after everything was said and done, they would pick the kids up, they'd pull up, the kids would jump in the car, and they were gone. We'd have them the entire morning. And so one day I asked the father, because I knew him, and occasionally they'd come in to pick him up, and I said, so, how come you and your wife never come to church? How come, you never come to Sunday school or participate? And they'd never been to a service. And they said, we're really not interested in any of that. We don't really care to go to church or really to even have a relationship with God. We just want our children to be exposed to these values and these things. And, and I guess it's better than nothing. But I don't know how much of any of that is going to stick if they're not reinforcing this at home, if they're not modeling this at home, if they're not practicing, these things at home. Again, if you look at the passage, the text, It's not take them to the synagogue and take them to the temple and let the temple teach them all the really cool stuff. It's like, no, it's when you go home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down. It's that this instruction is taking place all the time during the natural rhythms of life. And that you as parents are responsible ultimately for your children. And yes, it is critical that you find a good church that can pour into your children. But don't think for a second that's enough. That if you don't reinforce it at home, that you're not teaching your children, they're not going to get it at all. It's vitally important that you are doing what the passage says. That you are practicing these things in your home and constantly with your relationship with your children. Which leads to the final mistake that Christian parents make. They think, okay, we're going to do this, so we're going to have a family altar, and all of the spiritual instruction is going to take place at the family altar. And listen, I'm not against family altars. Great stuff. We used to do them when my kids were home, and we would stop, and we'd have times, where we would sit and very intentionally try to talk about the Lord and stuff like that. But honestly, as the passage says, teaching takes place during the rhythms of life. There's this thing called the teachable moment. That's how people learn. That's when it's real, That's when they're going through stuff. And so, you teach constantly. You teach your children to love the Lord as you read your 3-year-old the picture book of Noah and Samson and David and Goliath and Paul and his journeys and all of that stuff. You teach your child about the Lord when you pray for a sick friend during the blessing at the dinner table. You teach your children about the Lord when you reinforce and reaffirm just how much God loves them after they've just gone through a painful breakup. You teach them about the Lord when you put a spiritual spin on current events and you talk about how that relates to us and our relationship with God. You put that, you teach them about the Lord, all of the time. And again, during the teachable moments. And so we're teaching all the time. And it's important for us to be aware of this so that we can make the most of the opportunities that we have. Again, we are the ones who are responsible for teaching our children. And so in a sense, our children are our students. And the Bible is our textbook. And life is our classroom. And so, yes, we teach our children to love God through instruction, and we need to instruct our children. We also teach our children through guidance and correction. This is like the super unpopular one, right? So this is the one that we Christians get kind of dinged on sometimes. And now I got to find the verses because I'm way ahead of myself. Proverbs 22:6. We've heard, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. Proverbs 13:24. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. And there are many other verses like this one that are just as politically incorrect. The whole spare the rod, spoil the child kind of thing. And I think society is completely misunderstood and misrepresents this concept of the rod, so to speak. So, the spirit of the rod is not one of anger or even one of punishment. It is of loving correction because we care about our children and we want what's best for them. By the way, the rod is a pastoral implement. So there's the rod and the staff, right? So the staff is kind of like where the crook is, and they can hook the sheep and all those kind of things. But the rod is a stick. And even today, if you look at videos or pictures of shepherds in the Middle East, they got the rod, and they're usually walking by the sheep and they're tapping the ground. And then if the sheep start to get off, they nudge the sheep and they correct the sheep. I don't know that I've ever seen a video or image of a shepherd just wailing on the sheep with the rod. I've never seen that image because that's not the purpose of the rod. That's not what the rod is. It's not what the rod does. The rod is actually a comforting implement in the life of the sheep, because the sheep know that the rod is taking them to the places that are good. It is taking them to shelter. It is taking them to food. And as they follow the tapping on the ground, again, typically the shepherd doesn't even have to touch the sheep with the rod. The sheep learn the cadence of the stick and how to direct and how to guide, which again is why the psalmist can say, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then finally, children who do not receive correction, children who do not receive discipline, tend to be miserable, tend to be unhappy children. And there's this tendency to turn out selfish and unprepared for life. Like, have you ever been around children who have license to do like anything they want to do? Like, you run into them in the supermarket sometimes, right? You see them running around and you're like, oh my goodness, how quickly can I get out of here? I think I need something in that aisle on the other side of the store, because you just don't want to be around them. You ever been around children who have never been told no? You ever been around children who have never had anyone correct them in their lives? Or when somebody did try to correct them, the parents came to their defense and made their children out to be victims? Those children don't do well. They're not prepared for life. They don't have self-discipline. They don't know how to cope with people and situations, and because they've never been trained. They've never learned discipline, and they just don't do well. Like, so Cindy and I know this family, and they have a nephew who grew up in an uber rich family, like super rich family. Like, this young man grew up in a $10 million home, literally. Was always given everything that he ever wanted. As far as we could tell, never been told no for anything. And grew up pretty much unsupervised, because the parents were so busy out, both of them, out making money and living the good life. Well, this young man was a parent by 16, divorced and remarried by 18, a college dropout by 20, and then by 21 was a complete bum who figured everybody else owed him a living and had just a complete entitlement mentality, and the parents have no idea what to do. Now they're like, okay, give us some instructions about what to do. Well, at that time, you're probably too late, because they missed those opportunities for discipline, and they missed those opportunities for correction. Again, we do this for the sake of the child. We love this child. We want to give this child tools and the skills to be able to be successful in life. But more than anything, we want them to love the Lord. That's the whole point of the passage. Love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And we want to instill that in our children. And again, we do it by setting an example. We do it by instructing our children in the ways of the Lord. And we do it through correction and spiritual discipline and guiding them in the appropriate ways.